Hey guys, welcome back to my channel. Timestamps and a full list of materials are in the description. Lately, I have created a dozen paintings for my friends' nurseries. Watercolor paintings are a beautiful gift idea and simply look amazing in nurseries. In this tutorial, I will show you the basics on how to paint this hot air balloon. Pastel colors are very calming and a popular choice for nurseries. This is why in this video I will show you how to mix and use them. First, let's start with a line drawing. While you can freehand your line drawing, I prefer to use some tools to make it easier. You can use a plate or a lid to draw a round shape. Mark out the approximate center. Then you change the shape at the bottom of the ball. You can use a ruler to make sure that it is symmetrical. It should touch the original ball on both sides at approximately the same distance from your center marking. Once you're happy with your balloon, add the basket. The horizontal lines of the basket are rounded to create some perspective. You can use a ruler to mark out the outer edges of the basket in order to center it under the balloon. This is where the marking you created earlier at the center of the ball comes in handy. All you have left to do now is to add some details like the bow on the basket, the segments on the balloon, and the rope that connects the basket and the balloon. Once you are happy with the line drawing, you can then remove all unnecessary markings with an eraser. Pastel colors are mixed by adding white watercolor to any color. In order to get the best effect, select a bright color like pink, turquoise, emerald green, yellow, or even purple. If you want to make your painting pop, use two contrasting colors for your masterpiece. In order to get the color just right, I tested on a sheet of paper while mixing. There is a whole discussion out there about if white and black watercolor should be used at all, but I'm staying out of it. In general, blacks and grays can be mixed using other carefully selected watercolors. And colors can be lightened by adding more water instead of adding white. For this painting, I specifically decided to use white watercolor to mix these intense pastel colors. If you have an opinion about using black or white watercolor, or if you have questions, feel free to leave me a comment. Let's start with the underwash. I pre-wet each segment with clear water before I add watercolor to it in order to avoid hard edges. The clear water is not applied all the way to the edge of the segment because it helps me to create clean edges with the watercolor. I add a very light wash of watercolor to each segment of the balloon. I will intensify the colors later. When I add the underwash, I try to keep the middle area of each balloon segment very light and let the white paper shine through. I also add more water to the middle and let the water do the work for me. It will push the pigment aside and leave an amazing pattern. The segments of the balloon are touching, and it will cause bleeding if I have wet watercolor touch another area of hot watercolor. And that's really not what I want. So I will first paint all the blue segments and then all the purple segments. The watercolor dries pretty quick, and the first area that I painted will be dry enough to have another area touch it once I make my way around. In fact, the watercolor on this type of paper dries so fast that I need to be careful to not leave any brush strokes on it. If brush strokes or hard edges appear, I just wetten my brush and add some more water to it to loosen up the pigment a little and remove the brush strokes. In order to make my life easier, I'm using two brushes here. One brush is only for the clean water and the other brush is for the pigment. It makes my life easier because I do not have to wash out my brush all the time. When you fear that you might accidentally touch your wet watercolor areas with your hand while painting the next segment, just let it dry for a few minutes. you can move on and just paint another area during that waiting time. Let's work on the basket next. I'm using some light brown wash for the basket, and I try to get a really uneven wash. I want the basket to not be a flat, solid color. To achieve this, I'm wettening the basket first, and then I drop in the pigment. I move the pigment around with my brush, but I also just let it bleed. In the end, the edges to the left and right side of the basket and the inner part of the basket should be darker than the centerpiece. This is not a detail painting, so the shadows don't need to be perfect, but darkening these areas will help the eye to see that this is a round object. In order to darken my watercolor, I just use more pigment, so I mix in less water with my watercolor. And remember, this is just a first wash. The colors will be intensified later on, and details will also be added later. Let's work on the green top area of the hot air balloon next. I pre-wetted that area, but it's not soaking wet. It actually looks more wet on the video. Also, the water soaks into the paper pretty fast, so I might have to wait a minute, depending on the paper, and re-add some water. I then add some light wash of the green I mixed up earlier, and I try to work out all my edges and create straight edges. While the light wash is drying, I will drop in some more pigment and create some lines. Since the watercolor is still a little wet, the color will bleed a little, but it will not disperse over the entire area. I'm using the same color for it that I used before. It's just more intensified, so there is less water added to the watercolor I'm applying. Just in case the more intense watercolor is spreading out into all directions, there's an easy fix for that. Wash out your brush completely in a clean jar of water, then dry it off on a paper towel as good as you can and soak up the watercolor that did spread out. You are going to use your brush like a sponge, and you might have to dry out your sponge on the paper towel and repeat the same thing again. At this point, I want my watercolor to appear uneven. I want some cauliflowers in there. I want the blooms, and I want my watercolor to be spread uneven. It will make the whole painting look more interesting in the end. Embracing the imperfections will make this painting a hit or a miss. Just in case one of the lines does not bleed as expected, if the paper is all ready to dry, use a damp brush to add some more water. Your brush will be touching the line you just created, and the water will flow in the direction where you just added the water. I'm already starting to work out some of the details of this painting. Let's add a bit of green watercolor to the area at the bottom of the balloon. Once the green watercolor is kind of evenly on that area, I will use a wet brush to drop in some water. The water will leave patterns and move the watercolor around a little. It just makes it look uneven and more interesting. Your watercolor should be unevenly applied at this point and leave patterns and blooms on your painting. The important thing is that your lines need to be straight in order to make this painting look neat. Whenever a line did not come out as straight as you wanted it to be, or if you did not manage to stay within the lines, you can quickly soak it up with a paper towel. Please let it dry completely and don't mess around with it. There is a way to fix it later on, but only when it is completely dry. When you try to fix it now, it will leave blooms and it will just leave a mess. When it's completely dry, you can use a damp brush to soften up some of the pigment on your paper, and then you soak it up with a paper towel. A lot of times I find it easier to turn the page when I try to draw straight lines. Since we're not working with a lot of water with this painting, there was no need to tape it down in the first place. So it's really easy to just lift up your page and turn it around to whatever direction works best for you to create a straight line. So to paint the purple segments, I use the same method that I used before for the blue segments. I pre-weten the segment, but only the center of it, not all the way to the edge of it. And then I'm using my watercolor filled brush to draw a straight line. That straight line will close the gap between the blue segment and the water that I dropped on earlier. This helps me to create a straight line, and it will be a hard edge since I'm drawing on dry paper where that little gap is that I'm closing. The watercolor will bleed out from that area where I just dropped it in, and I can correct where it's bleeding. I can add some color, or I can even drop in some water to create some patterns and have the water push the pigment to the side. Leaving the central area of each segment white will make it appear closer to the eye, and it's easier for the eye to understand that the area where the colors are touching is further away. So the light is not touching it as much and it lays more in the shadow. Having this large difference in color on any painting makes it look more interesting. All purple segments would just look boring and not as interesting and be not as much of an eye catcher. Once the painting dried completely, we can move on to the next layer of paint. For the next layer, I'm simply intensifying my colors. I add more of the blue pigment, and the watercolor I will be using is less diluted. If you're unsure if this is the right color, just test it on a sheet of paper. The next method to blend colors is really useful and easy, and in my experience it works best on non-cotton paper. Cotton paper soaks up the pigment deep in the fibers very easy, and with non-cotton paper it usually stays longer on the surface without soaking in the paper. You still need to work rather fast for this one to work. I fill my first brush with watercolor and I apply it to the page. Next, I soak up some water with another brush and I apply the water to the page. The watercolor that I applied first will bleed into the area that I wetted just now. It does give me great control over how far the watercolor can travel. But you need to be careful about leaving watermarks, like leaving a line where you applied the water, and you might have to soak them up or correct them a little bit. The easiest way to correct those watermarks is by adding some more water and applying the water all the way to the other side of the hot air balloon segment, so all the way to the purple segment. You might also have to soak up some of the water or some of the pigment with a brush that you just dried off in a paper towel. Just because you might have just applied water all the way to the purple segment, I recommend that you let this first area dry before you do the other side of your hot air balloon segment. This is why I'm first doing all the left sides of all the blue segments, and then I do all the right sides of the blue segments. When I'm done with all the blue left sides, the first ones I did should already be dry enough for me to work on the other side of each segment again, without uncontrollable bleeding. Let's work on some details. I will be intensifying the colors of this decorative piece at the basket, and I want the lower side of it to be darker than the top side. Creating color variations makes this painting really interesting. While the watercolor is still wet, I'm dropping in some more intense pigments and just let them bleed. As an alternative, I can first apply the more intense pigments and then use a wet brush to wetten the area where I want the watercolor to bleed into. The main thing here is to make it look interesting and not flat, so you need to have large color variations. Let's make the bow look more interesting. I'm adding a more intense version of the purple pigment to the very center of it. Next, I wetten the area to the left and right of that purple dot with some clear water, and I let the pigment bleed into that area. This will create patterns and watermarks. Now let's intensify the purple parts of the hot air balloon. I simply added more purple pigments to the color that I mixed earlier for the underwash. Here I'm going to use the same method that I used earlier for the blue segments. I apply the purple pigment next to the blue pigment and create a hard line there, a straight line. Then I use a damp brush and apply water next to it. I let the purple flow into that area that I freshly wetted. I can move the watercolor around with a clean damp brush. I can apply more water to it, or I can use my brush as a sponge and soak up some of the water or pigment. Same as before, in order to give me more control, I first do all the left sides of the segments, then I turn the whole painting around and do all the right sides of the segments. Let's darken the shaded areas of the basket. The sides to the left and the right are darker because they are round, and the light is mainly shining on the center of the basket. Also, not as much light hits the inner side of the basket, so that also needs to be a bit darker. I apply some water to it, not a lot, not soaking wet. And then I apply the watercolor to it and let the watercolor bleed. When it bleeds, I can help it with my brush, and I can always add more water or more pigment while it's still wet. Let's also add some more pigment to the center of the bow. Once the green top area of the hot air balloon is dry, I realize that my lines, my shadows, need to be darker. So I apply a more intense and less diluted version of the same green, and I apply it in a straight line. Then I will use a wet brush to create an area that it can bleed into. Since those segments on the green part of the hot air balloon are so small, I will have to use a brush to soak up some of the water or pigment because it will be too wet, and preserving some highlights, some more or less white areas in the center of that area will just be too hard without planning to soak up some of the pigment with a brush. We're almost done with the painting. Let's darken up some areas, create some more highlights. Let's paint in those purple strings that connect the basket to the hot air balloon. And let's just have fun with this. Thank you so much for watching my video. I hope you enjoyed it. Please like and subscribe to my channel. Feel free to comment down below and ask away any questions you might have about painting this hot air balloon. Also, please let me know if you would like to see some more nursery paintings.